Well, the biggest issue for my city, which is Cape Town, is undeniably work, is employment. Something like 55% of young people in the city under the age of 24 are unemployed, not in work. These young people have no prospect of work because they simply don't have the education. And because our education system is in dire straits, we are not solving that problem. And this is a deeply structural problem that, of course, you cannot fix overnight. If we have to think about how African cities will change in the future, it is important to understand that sub-Saharan African cities are very different to South African cities. So 60 to 70% of the populations live in informal settlement conditions, often with no access to running water or sanitation or continuous energy. Within that environment, what that is telling us is that there's a massive pent-up demand for services and for infrastructure. But what will drive change over the next decade or two in African cities will be two forces. One, foreign direct investment from new global powers like China, India, Turkey, Indonesia. The second driver is the emerging middle class in these societies and what their aspirations are. And these emerging middle classes are essentially capturing all of the available resources for urban infrastructural investment. And hopefully, as people begin to realize that this is unviable, that it is basically stupid in terms of the long-term viability of these cities and economies, we will see a turnaround, and we will see investment in really indigenous thought about how we can build cities differently and how architecture and design can help us configure an African paradigm for urban development. Thinking through whether we are living through a uniquely complicated time for cities is obviously, it's a weighty question. Is it more difficult today than 300 years ago or 350 years ago when urbanization really started to take off in the Northern European context? Absolutely. And the reasons are relatively obvious if we think of the current debate internationally around this idea of planetary boundaries. It is inconceivable that we can continue on the current path into even the near future, even 30 years out, 40 years out. We simply don't have the natural resources. So we have to figure out how to, what the economists call, dematerialize the economy. In other words, find ways for well-being to increase, for economic growth to continue, but disconnected from the depletion of natural resources. And this is the big, big question for this century. Now, of course, that question is going to find expression in cities where people live. So really what we're talking about is finding ways to propel the growth of cities, to build in a new way, to live differently in just the next 10, 20, 30 years. Or else, as a civilization, we're stuffed.